Hello and welcome to Arise News. You're watching a special broadcast brought to you by Arise TV and global consultants Kpmg. It is Budget Day. It sounds just as dramatic as the Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, Judgment Day. We are live from the Insight Center in Kpmg Towers in Lagos, Nigeria, and we are going to be talking about diving deep into the 2023 budget signed by the President of Nigeria, Muhammadu Buhari. We've got a whole bunch of analysts, economists, executives joining us to answer a number of questions. What does the budget mean to you as an individual? What does it mean to businesses? What does it mean to the macroeconomy? You have questions, we have answers. We have representatives from the federal government. We've got the best and brightest from Kpmg. We've got a renowned economist joining us to have an in-depth conversation. And we're also joined by my awesome colleague, Rolake Akinkube-Filani.
Yes, indeed. And what would a Budget 2023 day be without the opportunity to engage on the discussion? So please do send in your comments and your questions to our Twitter handle at Arise TV. It is going to be a dynamic discussion with experts from a diverse range of industries. We can't wait to hear your thoughts and hear what our experts have to say. Over to you, Rotus.
Indeed, that's hashtag Arise TV Kpmg Budget Day at Arise TV and also at Kpmg_NG. All right, to kick things off, we're going to give you an overview of the budget. Here is our Arise correspondent, Oyi Sunday.
Nigeria's budget for 2023 is bigger than ever before. The proposed expenditure is 21.83 trillion naira. That's 20% higher than last year.
To achieve the laudable objectives of the 2023 budget, we must achieve our revenue targets. MDAs and government-owned enterprises must intensify their revenue mobilization efforts, including ensuring that all taxable organizations and individuals pay taxes due.
The figure was reached assuming an oil price of $75 a barrel and an output of 1.69 million barrels a day. The budget allows for an exchange rate of 435 naira to the dollar, a projected GDP growth rate of 3.75%, and a more than 17% inflation rate.
It's going to require facing the issue of oil theft head on and dealing with that. It's going to require addressing matters of insecurity. It's going to require encouraging investment in the oil sector by the oil majors. So when you look at it in balance, I think it's a budget that I would say, in terms of the parameters, they're not unreasonable, but there's some tough decisions that are going to be required to deliver on those budget numbers.
Defense gets the lion's share of the spending, almost 3 trillion naira, while education gets less than 1.8 trillion naira. Infrastructure and health both get less than 6% of the total. But all of this pales in comparison with the 8.33 trillion naira allocated for recurrent expenditure. That's money the government spends on things like salaries, rent, and interest payment. It even includes stationery. But it's not for paying debts. There's a separate 6.3 trillion naira set aside for that, almost 30% of the budget.
Public debt as a percentage of GDP should not be more than 40%. Domestic and external debt ratio should be 70-30. So at public debt to GDP, we have 22.8%. This is as at 2022, but this has since moved on to 35.33%. Once we, this is as of September, once we adjust to the ways and means that has already been approved to be securitized. So once we bring it in, this will take us to 35.33%.
Capital expenditure is sitting at almost 6.5 trillion naira. That's more than double the allocation for education and health combined. It's intended to be used for roads, buildings, and spendings that help the economy.
Recurrent expenditures are broadly in 4 categories. The most significant one being personnel costs. The truth is, currently, there's not much that we can do to bring down the personnel costs. We have actually been managing our recurrent budget as tightly as we can.
The budget's deficit is almost 11 trillion naira. It will mainly be financed by borrowing.
What has Nigeria achieved with the debt that it has accumulated, both domestic and international? One, labor productivity is flat and negative. Total factor productivity, which is the test for the optimal use of capital stock in the country, is 0.7%. It was even negative before then. So it shows really that from an economic evaluation, economic policy and impact analysis, that the economy has not done that well.
Overall, 22% of revenue is expected to come from oil sources. But this year's budget is based on the petrol subsidy only being in place until June. Given the huge public opposition to removing it, the 3.36 trillion naira allocated may not be enough. It's the last budget under President Buhari. With elections a few weeks away, the incoming administration will be greeted with a 77 trillion naira debt. Only Sunday. Arise News.
All right, great overview there from our correspondent, Oyi Sunday. I hope that whets your appetite because we have more. Now we're going to hear from Mr. Tola Ademi, Senior Partner at Kpmg Nigeria, also Chairman Kpmg West Africa, to give us a budget synopsis. Mr. Ademi, you're welcome, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rotus, and good morning, viewers. The 2023 budget is a 21.8 trillion naira budget. It's significant because it's a transition year budget. What this means is that the administration that has put in place this budget is not the same administration that will be seeing it through to the end of the year. It's also significant because it's a deficit budget, an 11.3 trillion naira deficit. So our country, Nigeria, has a revenue problem. Now, when we drill down into the revenues, it's good to note that non-oil revenues exceed our oil revenues. This speaks to diversification, but on the other hand, it also speaks to some extent to the underperformance of the oil and gas sector. When we drill further into our oil revenues, we see that they're predicated on certain key assumptions. One key assumption is the level of oil production, where we're projecting to do 1.69 million barrels per day. This is a big improvement on where we're coming from. And in order to deliver on this number, it's going to require real concerted effort by the current and incoming government to deal with the issue of oil theft. The other significant premise of the budget is that the subsidy is planned to end by June 2023. This is a decision that will require real courage on the part of the next administration. When we drill down into the deficit number, we see that it's going to be financed by debt. Most of that debt will come from domestic sources. This is not surprising considering the macroeconomic factors which make the cost of foreign debt prohibitive at the moment. But I suppose the point to be made here is that if any of the budget parameters are not met, if we should fall short on our budgeted revenues or exceed our budgeted expenditures, then we're looking at the possibility of a higher deficit and therefore more debt in order to finance that deficit. Looking at the thrusts of the budget, there's a big emphasis on security and defense, and this is understandable considering the current state of insecurity in our country. Indeed, security is fundamental for economic growth and for attracting the foreign investment that we so badly need. The other area is infrastructure. Infrastructure, as we know, unlocks the economy and indeed drives production. And here I'm talking about investments in roads, rail, ports, power, telecommunications, etc. So another fundamental area. Then we have the focus on social development, education, and healthcare. To achieve the kind of growth that we need as a nation, we need an educated and healthy workforce. But I suppose the real story here is that because of our revenue challenges, no matter how much is allocated to healthcare, infrastructure, or education, it can never be enough because government cannot solve these areas alone. There's a strong need for private sector investment. And this speaks to the need to create an enabling environment that will encourage private sector investment in Nigeria.
Yeah, you're watching the Arise News and Kpmg Budget Day 2023 live conference out of Lagos. Of course, we're doing this in partnership with Kpmg Nigeria, looking into Nigeria's budget for 2023, 21.8 trillion naira, which Tola Adeyemi, the chairman of Kpmg Nigeria, has been explaining, unpacking that particular budget, looking at the various elements of this particular budget.
Welcome back to Budget Day, brought to you by Arise TV and Kpmg. Remember the hashtag Arise TV Kpmg Budget Day. Tag us on Twitter at Arise TV and at Kpmg_NG. So we're talking about the budget, 2023 budget. We're going in depth, and we have, of course, one of our special guests that's going to be discussing this with us, Mr. Ben Akabueze, who is the Director General of the Budget Office of the Federation. Mr. Akabueze, you're very welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate your time. I want to start off with the fact that this is the budget of fiscal consolidation and transition. What would that mean? If you wanted to explain that to the everyday Nigerian, what exactly that means?
Well, fiscal consolidation simply means that you're aiming to begin to reduce the deficit and the borrowings. But it sounds like it sounds a bit contradictory, given that in absolute terms, those numbers seem to be going up, but in relatively speaking, I think that you will understand that. But transition just speaks to the point that this budget is going to be straddled to administrations, and therefore is one that is likely to change, but one also that has certain provisions in it that will not be there were we not dealing with a change in government. And so there are some expenditures you see in this year's budget that would normally not feature in regular annual budgets.
I want to talk to you about the revenues. We have a projection of, I believe, about 11 trillion for the 2023. However, we only performed to the tune of about 6.5 trillion for 2022 through November. Is that a bit ambitious as far as the 2023 revenues are concerned, the revenue projection?
If you looked at it that way, you could say it's ambitious. But guess what? Ambition and a lot of ambition is one thing we need with respect to our revenues, because they're still way below where they should be. And this is without prejudice to anything else that we need to do to fix the challenges with our public finances. We cannot get away from the fact that this government is simply not collecting enough revenues by whatever parameters that you measure that with. So yes, we need some ambition, but is this unrealistic? No. Okay, so let's say we close the year just stopping 7 trillion for this year. And then you're going to go to 11 trillion. The question is, what is it? First of all, there are some new things. There's some one-off items, like you have the 553 billion that the National Assembly missed out in the numbers that they sent through to the president to sign, which he was talking about, which includes money coming from sale of spectrum licenses, about 540 million, and then there is a loophole which foreign shipping companies doing business that revenues in Nigeria have been exploiting and not paying, which is one of the things that the Finance Act 2023 is plugging, and that also there's some projection about what's going to come in from that that source. So these are two items, for instance, that didn't exist in 2022. Okay, but also in 2022, the fuel subsidy in the fiscal framework is designed to operate only for the first half, up to the first half of the year, which means in the second half of the year, the basis of accounting for government revenues will be different. Because right now, fuel subsidies operate as an upfront deduction from government revenues. So when you look at that, that means that there's a 1.6 trillion naira. If we were going to operate the fuel subsidy regime for the whole of next year, the projected revenues for the federal government will have been short by 1.6, which again you have to adjust. By the time you adjust for all of those, you see that really, if anything, we should be accused of lacking in ambition in terms of the revenue growth between 2022 and 2023.
As far as non-oil revenues, we performed pretty well. As far even went over the in 2022, that's through November. I think about over 2 trillion. Can we depend on non-oil revenues going forward to perform well for us with respect to where oil is as far as the performance? I mean, with that we underperformed there. So is that a point at which a point of optimism for you looking ahead for non-oil revenues?
Well, first let me clarify that what you've called on non-oil revenue, there is actually non-oil taxes. Okay. Because the independent and other revenues are also collectively non-oil revenues. We have a broad categorization: oil revenues and non-oil revenues. Then within non-oil revenues, you break that also. You have the non-oil taxes. So that's what that 2.43 is. Okay. So the whole area of non-oil revenues, it's an area where even if we say so ourselves, we think that we have made significant progress on where we're coming from, 6 years ago. But we believe that there is still, room for, improvement, there. And so we see, for instance, that with the implementation of the e-customs, project, if that is driven diligently, we can expect to see customs revenue, continue to improve, significantly. But also, even with whether it's CIT and especially VAT. VAT is one area where we see significant upside. There's a lot. I mean, the last estimate that we had in terms of what's lost, VAT that is lost to non-compliance. VAT lost to non-compliance is reckoned to probably top 3 trillion naira. Wow. So as the FIRS continues to drive that with the increasing deployment of technology, some of which has been enabled by the new powers that they've got under the Finance Act. We see that again will even continue to do much better. So yes.
Encouraging. That is encouraging. Something that isn't encouraging though is debt. I guess we can get to debt and the deficit, but debt service to revenue for 2022, I think about 80%. So out of the 6.5 trillion through November, about 5.2, 5.4. So debt servicing. Should we be hitting the panic button with a figure like that?
Well, I mean, we hit the panic button a long time ago. Rule of thumb in public finance: once your debt service tops 30% of your revenues, you should start getting worried. Okay. So, but the question is, I mean, worrying is not a solution. Right. So what do you do? In our own case, we reckon that the sustainable solution is to try to grow the revenues, because once you grow the revenues, okay, that the ratio will come down. Of course, it's not just grow the revenues. You've got also to keep your eye on the cost of the debt. And that's why DMO, for instance, is actively trying to restructure the debt to lower cost sources and all of that. So, but unfortunately, this the revenue growth strategy hasn't moved as fast. So we face the dilemma: should you cut spending? First of all, if you want to cut spending, there's not much room in terms of your non-discretionary spending in the budget, unless you want to cut capital expenditure, which we think we are not doing enough of. By up to 2015, in the decade up to 2015, on the average, we had spent as a country under 20% of our budget, the expenditures actual on capital. So we came up with a 30% target. It's not law, it's not mandated, but it's a policy target that we set for ourselves to spend a minimum of 30%. But so we're struggling to keep it at that. But so once you aim for that target and then you capture your non-discretionary spending, there's not much room to cut spending. And right now, the single largest item on the budget is personnel cost. The only way you can realistically cut personnel costs today is
to fire people.
Is to fire people.
Yeah.
Okay. And government has reckoned that that's not a viable option in the present socioeconomic circumstances, because as you find in many countries where you have a social security system, you've hired the people, you've got to then keep them somewhat. Otherwise, what you save in cost of in salaries, you may be paying more in fighting crime. And so this government doesn't look at these things just purely in terms of numbers, and so you've got to then just keep going and trying to do the best that you can. Of course, you have the option always of selling assets, but that's a very controversial subject in Nigeria. If you look at the 2023 budget, for instance, you have privatization proceeds, 206 billion naira.
That's a very small number, though.
Yes, but it's a small number, but this is mostly coming from sale of power assets. At any point in time, you've got to then dimension what is it you have to sell that there is a consensus and there is a real appetite there for investors. But even this now is threatened because the state governments, some of the state governments are saying they don't want their share of the, in the power assets.
Yeah.
BP is holding in trust.
As the Bureau of Public Enterprises.
Yes, Bureau of Public Enterprises. The shareholdings of the federal government, the states, and even local governments in those assets. And if the privatization is going to be attractive to the private investors, it's got to be able to acquire a significant enough, chunk of the shares to give it control over running the business. So now, if the states are saying going to cut some of them, and say we don't want our shares sold, it might endanger this, and that's the challenge with asset sales as an option. It's not, you can't just get up
straightforward
and
as we
yes, yeah. and even the ones that you think are the most, the most obvious, like there are many things, even. For instance, selling the land where the police barracks at Falomo, and relocating the police. You think that's an easy thing?
But it's not. This is why we have you here, to give us these hard truths about what need to be done to augment our finances. Speaking of augmenting our finances, the deficit, are we still going to continue on a borrowing spree to plug that hole between revenues of about 11 trillion projected and then the expenditure is about 21? So what do we do here at DG? Is it still more borrowing?
No, we've basically said, look, it's not sustainable, and it's there stated clearly in our fiscal strategy, paper, the document, that this is not It's not sustainable, especially, I mean, on all other parameters of debt sustainability, we look good until you get to the debt service to revenue, ratio.
80%.
So, until we get revenues up to level that is desired, you cannot continue down the path of incremental, borrowings. And so we expect debt to, taper off.
If just a couple minutes to go, if you were, how does the average Nigerian interpret this budget? What's your message to Nigerians who are looking at this budget and say, what does this mean for me?
Well, the way people often interpret the budget, if they look there, the road leading to their house hasn't been paved. If it's not in the budget that they will pave that road, even if all the other roads in town have been paved, as far as they're concerned, there's nothing in the budget for them. Yeah. So I'd like to say that when people looks at the budget, what's the need for me, is think more holistically. So for instance, this budget plans to spend nearly 3 trillion on security. Is that for me and you? Yes, it is. Because some of us may live in parts of the country where the security threat is not that imminent, and so we do not appreciate the value of the cost of insecurity. But the expenditure to secure the country is for you and I, it's for everyone. The expenditure on healthcare is for everyone. I mean, you may not need it, you may not need public facilities, but there are people who do, including some of the staff who work for you. And for all of the criticism among folks like, you and about public health, healthcare, that is still where the bulk of Nigerians get from. And that's why when the doctors, in the public service go on strike, it creates the sort of chaos. But, people say, oh, there's nothing in the budget for us. Same with education. When you look, you may not be patronizing public education, but that's how the bulk of Nigerians, in our, for instance, you see, I read a tweet yesterday, it was interesting, one of the Nigerian nurses who's gone abroad. So she tweeted that she was chatting with a number of her colleagues at work, and one said, I have $75,000 of debt to pay, education debt. The other one said $100,000. And then they asked her, and she said, I don't owe any money. That, in fact, I went to nursing school free. He said that her colleagues screamed, whatever. But, these are all the things that if government were to charge for all of that, and, revenues show up, it will show up as expenditure, and they say, but essentially, people don't then realize that perhaps if the budget didn't provide for their wards to be educated free, maybe there will be fewer nurses than even we currently have in the hospitals or whatever, or maybe some of the children of those who work for you may not be able to go to school. So let's think less personally when you say what's in need for me in the budget.
Think of the whole country. Yes. Mr. Bennett Kabreze, thank you so much for joining us. Director General of the Budget Office of the Federation, we appreciate your time. It is, of course, Budget Day, Arise TV, Kpmg. We're now going to throw to my colleague, Rolake Akinkunmi-Filani, who's going to be having a conversation about the very important infrastructure.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Rotas, and thanks to the DG for the Budget Office on that very insightful discussion. Now, one particular theme that's been on everybody's lips is infrastructure, and I'm joined here today by Kpmg Salaudeen, Head and Partner of Infrastructure at KPM Nigeria.
Thank you very much, Rolake.
Great to be speaking to you. So, looking at that allocation, the World Bank has said that at this current rate of expenditure allocation to infrastructure, it could take us almost 300 years to meet our infrastructure requirements. Is that really to say that most of the other sources of funding will be from the private sector? What are your thoughts?
Rolake, this is exactly what we were talking about before we came on air. If you look at the 2023 budget, the federal government budget, the provision for infrastructure is right about 1.2 trillion. which comes in at about 6% of the total budget. If you assume that the federal government is half of the entire economy, and you look at the subnational, so you multiply that 1.2 trillion by 2, you end up at about 2.4 trillion naira, which if you use the exchange rate in the budget gives you about $5-6 billion.
Which is still not quite adequate.
Absolutely. However, it is important to understand that that is not, the total picture, because, and this is where the current government has been really successful in terms of finding creative off-budget ways of mobilizing funding for infrastructure. So if you look at the road infrastructure tax credit scheme, for example, it's been reasonably successful. If you also look at the Presidential Infrastructure Development Fund, which is an infrastructure fund managed by NSI, under which some key infrastructure projects are being delivered currently, you then begin to get a picture. However, what our analysis suggests is that, but even factoring in all of that, you still come in under $10 billion. Now, coming to your point, that $10 billion or less is still far inadequate compared to our needs as a country. The government has laid out an integrated infrastructure master plan that says essentially that to be able to make a dent on that infrastructure deficit, we need to be able to mobilize in excess of $100 billion on an annual basis.
And the mobilization is what I was going to come to, because the structuring of these projects and the need to crowd in private finance is going to be key. So I want to ask you, are there models of the ideal project that has taken place in Nigeria that serves as a benchmark for how infrastructure projects should be funded or structured?
Maybe this is the point at which, we can start getting into solutioning in terms of what do we need to do going forward to be able to, achieve more success, in this space. By the way, when this government came into power, our infrastructure stock as a percentage of GDP was at about 20%. Through the interventions and the focus that the government has put on infrastructure today, we're sitting on about 35% of GDP, which is significant progress within 8 years. However, as we said, the gap is still huge. So what do we need to do going forward? I think the first, is that we need to sustain and deepen the things we are doing.
So what are we talking about? Sovereign guarantees, enhancements, or what will help unlock that financing?
Those are more tactical issues. I think that the things we need to do are more macro, to be able to mobilize, further investment, private investment, into this space. For example, we talk about enabling the environment for the private sector to invest more in infrastructure going forward. One of the things we need to do is to enhance, the legislative framework. We have had ICRC law for many years now. That law has been revised, taking into account our experience as a country. It's still sitting in Parliament, for example. That law needs to be passed, without delay, because it gives potential investors certainty, in terms of our policy environment, in terms of our legislative environment. Now, coming to issues around guarantees and stuff like that, those will come under the purview of what we call, project preparation or project development. Remember that not all infrastructure projects are suited to private sector investment. So there is a significant upfront work that the government, needs to do to be able to identify, prioritize, and select the right candidate projects.
Fantastic.
For the private sector to come in.
So it's going to be
and
a partnership.
You need to invest in capacity as a government to be able to do that.
Great, fantastic conversation. Thanks for touching on those points around regulation and enabling the business environment. The conversation continues, and I'm now going to head back to Rotas to continue the discussion.
Thank you so much, Rolake. I really appreciate that very, very in-depth conversation there on the very important infrastructure. Now we go to another big conversation here, of course, on the macroeconomic analysis of the budget as far as the macroeconomy is concerned. I am joined by Mr. Adewale Ajayi, who is a partner and head of tax at Kpmg Nigeria, and of course, Dr. Ayo Teriba, who is an economist and the CEO of Economic Associates. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. The conversation keeps rolling on here on Budget Day with Arise TV and Kpmg. Mr. Ajayi, why don't you take us through, I guess, the metrics that we'll be looking at as far as the budget is concerned and the macroeconomy?
Thank you so much. The DG budget has spoken about the numbers, and so the dollar also spoke about the numbers. What I'm going to focus on the parameters underlining the budget itself. And the question, of course, we're asking is, how reasonable, how realistic, are those assumptions. So let me start, with the oil production in terms of volume. Right, we've said we're going to do 1.69 million barrels per day, and I think the question people are asking, especially from where we're coming from, in December we produced about 1.2 million barrels of oil per day, and the question is how realistic is that number. I think for us to know, oil, just like any other product, is driven by supply and demand factors, and there are several factors that will drive demand and that will drive supply. One factor, of course, is what's going to happen in China, especially with the resurgence of COVID. Will China continue its policy on no zero COVID? Of course, they've abandoned that policy, but we don't know what is going to happen. And of course, the other issue is what's going to happen in Ukraine, the Russian war. How long is it going to last for? And of course, the issue of OPEC reaction to all these issues. And maybe the fourth thing that I've thought about might be, are we going to have a buyer cartel? It will be interesting to see what the DG, think about that, or Dr. Teriba think about that. So when you look at those factors, I think the word out there is that the oil market, the global oil market is in deficit. So we'll expect that there might be a reduction in supply, but it will not be enough, for OPEC to change, its production per day. So I think looking at that from that perspective, that number is reasonable. When you come to Nigeria, and I think when you look at the current efforts that the government has done in terms of dealing with the issue of oil theft and security matters, and our production has gone up to 1.3. Yes, we're still below OPEC quota of 1.8 million barrels per day. But at least what we can see is that things, are looking up, and the oil companies now feel confident to inject more oil, into the terminals and to the pipelines. So I think, the verdict is that the 1.69 million is actually reasonable. And I think the next thing will be looking at the price at $75 per barrel, right? And then when you look at the forecast out there, the World Bank predicts that the oil price, for the whole of 2023 will be in the range of $92, and it's the same sentiment that is shared by the U.S. Energy Information Administration. And then you look at some other companies, other agencies, analysts from IMF think that it's going to be around $79. ING thinks it's going to be about $200. The same thing with JP Morgan. It's going to be around that particular figure. I think the general sentiment when it comes to price is that the oil market is bullish. So I think to that extent, $75 look reasonable, right? But then the question then is, what's going to be the floor? Despite the bullish sentiment being expressed there, how low can oil go in 2023? And you look at what the U.S. government has done in terms of when they're going to replenish the strategic petroleum reserve. They've said they're going to do that when it is between $68 and $72. So the floor price appears to be $70. So to that extent, we should be looking at $70, at the floor price. But then the question then is, should we be edging, against $70? It would be interesting again to hear what the DG budget has got, to say about that. Okay. And then when you look at inflation rates, what I think is 17.16. In 2022, the rate was about 21%. And of course, people are asking, will this, stay the same? My prognosis, based on what I've seen, is that probably going to stay in the 20s, for 2023. And then, of course, exchange rate, there's so many factors that are driving that. What happens in the oil industry, right? I think, that may, probably stay around the figure that is being projected. And then, of course, we come to the issue of subsidy, which is a big elephant in the room.
Huge.
And the way I look at it is this, to borrow the quote from our current Minister of State for Petroleum. He says something, and I find it very interesting. He said one thing about Nigeria is that, we like to expect the impossible, while avoiding the inevitable. Now, let me give you some facts when it comes to subsidy. Last year in 2021, subsidy cost per month was about 119 billion
2021
naira.
or 2022?
2021.
Okay, 2021.
Was 119 billion naira per month.
Wow.
That was the cost of subsidy.
Yeah.
And it cost us about 42% of our crude oil revenue. In 2022, up to the 7 months to July 2022, that figure rose astronomically to 292 billion naira per month.
Wow.
And that cost us about 72% of our crude oil revenue. When you look at budget 2023, okay, it is in the range of 560 billion naira per month.
It's mind-boggling.
And so the question is, what has happened between 2022, when the cost per month is about 292 to 560, and that is the issue that a lot of people are asking. And of course, there is the issue of transparency in managing. We don't even know, how many liters of petrol we consume in Nigeria. Right. Is it 82 million liters per day? Is this 67? Is this 68? We need to resolve that number to be able to determine whether the subsidy issue, is reasonable. So if I quickly go to the GDP growth, IMF has predicted that 1/3 of the world economy will go into recession. And we're already seeing that. We've seen layoffs in America. We've seen layoffs in everywhere. So I expect that despite what IMF has said, they still expect that the world economy will grow by 2.7% in 2023. And interestingly, they say Nigeria economy will grow, by 3% in 2023. We remember that in 2022, IMF predicted that Nigerian economy will grow by 3.2%. But 11 months to November, I think we did achieve about 2.25%.
That's right.
My prognosis is that GDP growth will probably stay below, 3% in 2023. All right. So those are the issues when it comes to the parameters. But let me quickly look at the deficits. Right. I think what is interesting is that when you look at the deficits, right, about 9 trillion is going to be financed by loans, by new loans. Right. 9 trillion. And the question on the mind of people is, where would that new loan, come from? Is it going to be coming straight from CBN loans, right?
Ways and means.
Ways and means,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
That is, that is left for us, to see.
Yeah.
Now, well, the other issue, I'm not so much worried about the refinancing risk or the exchange rate risk, right? My concern has always been with the default risk.
Right.
Can we afford to sustain this level of debt? Yes, in terms of the debt stock itself, we're within our self-imposed limit of 40%. All right, and we're within the 55% that the IMF itself has projected.
Yeah.
All right, we're doing about 35% if you include ways and means. But the question is the debt service to revenue.
Yeah.
In 2021, our debt service to revenue, was in the range of 80. In 2022, just based on the 11 months to November, that was 81%.
Yeah.
Yes, when you look at the budget for 2023, we projected, about 60% as debt service to revenue. But the question is, can we sustain that? Bearing in mind that we're still going to take, 9 trillion, of loans. So that is the issue that we need to worry about. Right. And of course, yes, we have the issue of privatization proceeds, sale of spectrum license for frequency bands. But those are one-off. We need sustainable, revenue. And just quickly to address the issue of revenue challenge. Okay. I mean, based on what we've said, we clearly have revenue challenge, right? I mean, if we're doing about 8% of revenue to GDP, the expectation is that we should be doing 15%, right? That is the target that the government is working towards.
And you're a tax man, so
I am a tax man.
Yes.
And so, of course, and we know that tax revenue is, it's sustainable, right? But again, we need to go beyond that. We need to do something that is more dynamic, something that is more radical, and something that is more innovative. And that takes me to the issue, of IJV. Yes, I must admit that the PIA makes provision for IJV, and rightfully so. It says it is discretionary on the part of the partners. They have to decide whether they want to convert to IJV or not.
And that's a joint venture, that's for our viewers. That's the joint venture agreement between government and,
yes, and the oil companies.
And the oil companies. Okay.
And, what is the business case for IJV? When you look at the current system of the unincorporated joint venture, what we know is that the current system is fraught with cross-operational inefficiencies. And then we then have suboptimal capital investment because of delayed funding. Because for UJV, Government has to bring its own funding. The operators have to bring its funding. But we have problems with government, funding, and that has delayed the ability of the ventures to deliver value, for us. So what I see that is going to happen if we go along the IJV route is that, number one, we're going to unlock value in the system. We're going to be able to increase our production. We can even see from the production profile of PSCs and JVs, because PSCs, are funded, production sharing contracts, are funded, by the contractors. So they don't have the constrained funding. So they're able to increase, the production, right, compared to the JV partners. The other thing I think is going to happen is that cost is going to come down because of the efficiency that's going to come in. Okay. And then thirdly, of course, is the fact that revenue is going to go up. Revenue to government by way of government take, right, dividend and taxes, right? And so that is very important, that we do that.
Great stuff. So very optimistic notes to end on. Dr. Aya Teriva, economist, CEO, I thank you for joining us. Please, I want to get your context for Nigeria within the global matters as far as what you see us in terms of the budget.
Right, yes. Well, thank you very much. I'm glad to be a part of the conversation. And I would like to, commend the organizers for the thoughtfulness. And I would also like to...
Yes, carry on. Yes, carry on.
I'd like to acknowledge, the DG Budget Office of course. Federation.
Yes.
And the team to which it belongs, the entire team in the Ministry of Finance. We've seen 8 years of increased disclosure of fiscal details. I'm not sure there had been any other time in the past that we had been this informed, about what's happening to the budget. Yeah. And they not only provide granular details, they also make themselves available, as we interrogate this. Right. So I thank them. They did it. They've done it every year, and they've done it again this year. Now, because you have kept us informed, of course, we would ask
more questions.
Yes, you take that in good faith. And we would want to assess the realism of the things that we are hearing. So my first premise is to, acknowledge the fact that this is not the easiest of times for anything you are trying to do. That is true for the world economy. I am not sure there's any country that is finding things easy at the moment. The world itself is in the eye of the storm, inflicted by the ripples effect of the, Russia-Ukraine war. Nigeria is not exempted. And if you need evidence of how hot the seat is now for Nigeria, just go and read the reports released by the likes of S&P, Moody's, or Fitch. All of them have had copious things to say about Nigeria. All of them more or less saying the same thing about our external financing conditions, about our budgetary, difficulties, and about our debt problems, and particularly debt costs. So, and the states are in no better position, and companies are not in any better position as well. So it's not, it happens that only 2 countries are counting body bags. All other countries are involved by proxy. We are not counting body bags, but we are counting something else, whether job losses, gross reversal, devaluation, etc. Yeah. So I needed that context, for us to say, it's not a year. It's a year that you are hoping that damage will be controlled. Okay. So I now move to the budget announcements. Okay. The way it hits me is that in spite of the problems that I have just acknowledged, the budget looks to me to be rather optimistic.
Okay.
Let me put it like that.
Yeah.
To expect revenue, last year, 2022, revenue increased by 1 trillion from 6 trillion in 2021 to 7 trillion in 2022. 7 trillion is the peak revenue performance of this administration in 8 years, as a matter of Nigeria's peak revenue in history, in Naira terms. Not to mention the fact that if you correct that 7 trillion for devaluation, it's probably less, much less than the 4 trillion, 5 trillion that we were doing. So to tell me that revenue is going to go from 7 trillion to 10.5 trillion before the end of this year, looks to me, that's something that,
Gotcha.
I mean, is this realistic?
Right.
The second is the biggest component of spending is not personnel cost, is interest payment.
Debt servicing.
Yes, debt service. So last year, of the 7 trillion revenue, we paid 6 trillion on interest payment. And so of the 14 trillion that we spent overall, 6 trillion out of it went on debt. Only 8 trillion was left for any other type of spending, which is recurrent capital. And so we borrowed 7 trillion and added it to the 1 trillion left in revenue after we paid debt. So the suggestion, the budget for this year for debt cost, only marked that 6 trillion up by 0.39 trillion. So we paid 6 trillion last year. I'm reading in this budget that we are planning to, we budgeted to pay 6.39 trillion. And I said, how can that be? Even if the overall budget stood at 44 trillion, that it was at the end of September, global interest rates this year, domestic interest rates this year will be much higher than last year. So you should expect that even on 44 trillion, you will pay more than 6 trillion in interest. But we are told 10 trillion is going to be issued to finance this year's deficit. Another 22 trillion is going to be issued by securitizing of ways and means. So we are told the debt will move from 44 trillion to 77 trillion by May.
Right.
Now, so that's a 75% increase in the budget stock. So if you paid 6 trillion or 44 trillion, minimum is to mark up that 6 trillion by 75% of 6 trillion. So you are paying, that's 4.5. So you are paying 10.5 on interest payment. And that takes all the 10.5 you are expecting on revenue. I have my doubts that we can raise revenue of 10.5. I'll be more likely to say we could do 8 trillion. But now, debt cost looks clearly likely to be more than that 8 trillion. Likely to take away the entire revenue. So whatever money we'll be spending next year, all must be borrowed. Okay, they don't all have to be borrowed. The point is, having deficit is one thing. How you finance the deficit is another. It's not just by borrowing that you can finance deficit. From the figures you had, if you go to the the first item there could have been bigger. It's a question, we can debate how do we make it bigger. And the last item there,
privatization,
could be bigger. I really don't like to call it privatization. I would prefer to call it financialization.
Okay.
I'll be the first to disclose that this smallest
of privatization
is something that I have been involved in for about 6 years now. I'm the vice chair of the technical committee of the National Council on Privatization. So I'll be the first to tell you that this malperformance is not for lack of trying. Okay? passes were completed, shots were taken.
Yeah. And then something happens.
As Ben will tell you, not all the shots that are taken, gets to be on target.
Yeah.
I'm not here to make an excuse.
Yeah.
I'm saying that I appreciate how difficult it could be.
Yeah.
We are here talking to Ben. We are here engaging with Ben.
Yeah.
The situation that I and the technical committee are,
yeah,
or even the situation that the National Council of Presidential is in, is different. Because the makers of the budget is not us. It's the 470 elected people. 360 in the House, 109 in the Senate, and 1 in the presidency.
Executive.
It is a joint ticket. The president has 470. So whatever midfield dribbling you did, whatever shots it took, if you can't get the ball into the net at that level,
you're not going anywhere.
You're back to square zero. So, but my point is that instead of proposing that we borrow assembly, as we're saying, if this was a company, they will be proposing to raise equity
rather than debt.
So we already owe 44 billion in debt. Our equity position, I am not sure this administration has issued any equity in 8 months, in 8 years. So why not consider equity? And all other countries that are strong, that still have control of their budget, if they project revenue, it happens. If they say they are going to spend, they spend. All of them, without exception, are relying more on equity.
Dr. Tereba, we have to leave it there. We have
equity.
We have to leave it there.
I hope
a solution.
This administration, in the 5 months left, could explore equity issues so that we don't take debt to 77 trillion. And if they don't, that the incoming government be encouraged by
do that,
to do more like this.
Dr. Ayo Teriba, economist, CEO, Economic Associates, and Mr. Adewale Ajayi, partner, head of tax at Kpmg. Thank you so much for a very in-depth conversation. Wish we had more time. But now I've got to throw back to Rolake, who is going to be talking to us about, I believe, the digital economy. Rolake.
Yes, thank you indeed, Rochas. Those conversations could go on and on. But now we're talking about the digital economy and from the perspective of the budget. And to join me on this discussion is Lawrence Amadi, who is the partner and head tech assurance at Kpmg. Great to have you with us, Lawrence.
Thank you very much, Rolake.
Before we get into the thrust of the conversation, we've had a question come from Twitter. This is a really fun and interesting one. And someone asked, what are the top 5 not so great investments made by the current administration? What are your thoughts, Lawrence?
Very tricky question, Rolake, but I think the first one for me might be education. If you look at investments, we had students sit at home for 7 months plus. I think we probably could have done a lot more. But again, I think in fairness to government, if you look at advanced countries and listening to the DG, what they pay as school fees is not what we pay as school fees. So there's quite a bit to be done. Second will be power. I think power certainly does need some attention. We could have done better. The third for me, let me think here. I'd say infrastructure. But because I'm a digital guy, I would also say digital infrastructure does need some.
And of course, we could go on and on. We don't have time to go through all 5. But talking about the digital economy, how can we move from a situation where revenue generation from the digital economy positions it as just a cash cow to seeing it as something that adds productivity to the economy? What do we need to do to move from that sort of status?
Excellent question. So to start off, I think I'd like to educate the viewers. What does digital economy mean? This is a combination of the digital connections that we see via the internet or Internet of Things or robotics that pull people together, it pulls devices together, it pulls mobile connectivity together just to help us generate revenue. So when you look at things like e-commerce, and when you look at things like the telecom sector, the media, all of these are the digital players. Now, to move in the direction of how do we start monetizing this, there are 5 core things to think about when you look at the digital economy. First will be the digital skills. That's one. Two will be digital platforms, very crucial. And the dominant players for platforms is in the Americas and China. So when you look at the West, Far West and East, they dominate the platforms play. And, the likes of Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, just name it. They dominate this play, and same for China. Europe and Africa, we're still lagging quite a bit. The third area is digital financial services. And this is where the fintechs all feature. The fourth area is digital infrastructure, extremely crucial because all of the platform play happens here. And the fifth is digital entrepreneurship.
Great list there. And if we look at some of the figures from last year, the digital economy has increased its contribution to revenues to well over 400 billion. So I guess my final question is, what are you most excited about for the digital landscape looking ahead into 2023 that could really help give an uptick to the revenue potential?
Again, really lovely question. So for me, the two key points to focus on would be the robotics process automation area, what we call automation, and the second area will be the infrastructure and platforms. I think these two areas are areas that government should start thinking about. How do we better monetize what we do in this area? How do we increase the footprint and the play? Because it will impact manufacturing, it will impact drilling and exploration, like the DG mentioned, when you talk about Dangote. It's going to impact every single facet if we do focus on automation, robotics, and on platforms and infrastructure.
Okay, fantastic. That's such a great conversation, and we look forward to hearing much more about the potential of the digital economy. So I'm going to shoot right back to Rotus in the studio to continue the conversation.
All right, thank you so much, Rolake. And I am personally very excited about robotics, let me tell you. So great conversation there. It is still Budget Day, Arise TV and KPMG. We continue the conversation. Great Twitter questions there. Hashtag Arise TV, KPMG Budget Day. Also at Arise TV, at KPMG_NG. We're going to talk about the finance bill. And we have with us Mr. Uzochukwu Obienu, who's a partner, tax, KPMG Nigeria. And yes, you're in the hot seat for a very interesting conversation on the finance bill. My first question to you, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Why is this still finance bill? Why not finance acts? That's what a lot of folks at home are wondering.
Okay, that's a very interesting question, and it's important that we actually set the context using that question, because it's a bill because it has not been assented to by the president. It has not been signed. But it's important to note that the Senate and the House of Reps have both passed the bill. So it's been sent to the president for assent. I guess the question is, why hasn't it been signed? Yeah, and I would like to again draw from the public presentation by the Minister of Finance, where she did say that some form of consultation is still ongoing with respect to certain provisions that the finance bill, when it becomes an act, is seeking to amend. So we expect that as the consultation continues and stakeholders are consulted, at some point there will be some form of harmonized decision around those provisions, and then it will ultimately be passed and becomes an act of parliament.
All right.
Signed, yes.
Can you take us through some of the changes in this finance bill?
Okay. So to start with, the finance bill seeks to amend about 10 pieces of legislation within the country, whether it's VAT, the value-added tax, the capital gains, the Companies Income Tax Act, and so many other pieces of legislation, about 10 of them. Now, I'm going to attempt to go through, because it's quite detailed, right?
Yes,
but I'm going to attempt to go through a few of them, and then I'll cluster some of the discussions in a way that it also makes sense for us. Yep. Okay. So the first one, which I love so much, is that right before now, when you incur a capital loss, what we call a capital loss is when you dispose of an asset, right? And you incur a capital loss on one asset, but incur a capital gain on another asset. The law says, pay me tax on the gain and deal with the loss. But
going forward, the bill seeks to amend that. It's a very important concept in taxation called loss harvesting, where I'm able to pull together my losses and the gains. And then if there's a net gain, then we can pay an amount. But if there is no gain, then I shouldn't be expected to pay anything because I've incurred a loss. In fact, he went further to say that you can now even carry forward the losses, just in the unlikely event that you are unable to relieve all the losses within the year of assessment. So you are able to take it forward. I think this is a very right step in the right direction because the investing public and the businesses have been clamoring for this, and the government has listened and it's been proposed in the bill to have this amended. Now, the second point I would like to talk about is incentives, and I would like to talk about them together. There are a number of incentives that have been, in a sense, removed, like rural investment allowance, the reconstruction allowance. But there are other incentives that are being proposed. Now, those incentives that are being proposed are proposed in the areas where we think that we necessarily need to incentivize for us to unlock significant growth. A very good example is some of the incentives that are being proposed with respect to companies that are into gas utilization. Obviously, you know that gas for us is a very big deal in Nigeria. In fact, identified as our transition energy. Some people even viewed Nigeria as a gas reserve, as a gas nation, rather than an oil-producing nation. So there are incentives that are supposed to encourage investment and production of gas and are subject to certain conditions. But on the one hand, there are some other incentives that have also been removed that the government did not consider that they should go forward with such incentives, right? Now, there is also a very important concept that 2 years ago was removed from the law. You know, that it's particularly is with respect to savings in deferred annuity plans. So 2 years ago, people had the ability to make savings in deferred annuity plans, and such premiums paid were liable as tax deductible expenses when computing the personal income taxes of such individuals. But about a year ago, you know, the Finance Act, the last Finance Act, actually took that out. Okay, it took that out, and what it meant was that encouragement to keep saving was no longer there, and so reintroducing that now gives opportunity for people to begin to, you know, make savings. We want to encourage a savings culture. We even, you know, we've launched a savings bond. Okay, so it's one way of saying that we're doing all of this together. So the savings bond is there. The tax deductibility on premiums from deferred annuity plans has been reintroduced, of course, subject to some conditions, but it's, for me, another right step in the right direction. Now, there are also clarifications with respect to where the government appoints a company as an agent for the purpose of VAT collection. You know, if you recall, a few months back, there was the FIRS appointed certain companies, you know, as agents for the purpose of VAT collection. And of course, it's a no-brainer. The reason for that, it's easier for those companies to, you know, to collect the VAT and remit than to chase the individual vendors that they work for. So the finance bill is also is providing some clarification around how that will work in terms of remittance, time to remit, and all that. And there are so many other provisions, right, in terms of how the next fiscal year will play out in terms of the funding of the fiscal year. Let me stop here for this, and then we can pick up all of.
All right, so education, because we got that question on Twitter where someone asked what the top 5, I guess, bad investments were on the government's part. Your colleague, Lawrence, somebody said, look, more could have been done on education, right? Yes. That was his number one pick there with Rolake when they're talking about the digital economy. So on that note, on education, There is, of course, a consideration, I believe, where the tax goes from 2.5% to 3%. And we actually just had a special over the weekend on education and taxes. So I wanted you to please get your thoughts on that, because wasn't it just a year ago that it was increased from 2% to 2.5, and now we're pushing to 3? So please take a swing. What's happening here with this education provision?
Okay. First, I'd like to say that I don't know that it's in the bill. The bill made available by to the public.
All right,
does
as we
not
know
have
it.
that.
Yeah.
So, but just in case we find that education tax increases from 2.5 to anything, whether 4, 5, whatever 3, it is, whatever it is that it increases to, right? My first comment will be that clearly we are on all fours that a lot more needs to be done as far as education is concerned in Nigeria. I mean, if you think about the recent ASU strike that kept
for 8
months, I mean, and in fact, we have not seen the effect of that yet. We just saw the action. The real effect is still in the future. But if you think about all of that, you will almost agree that a lot more needs to happen in terms of investment in education, and particularly tertiary education in Nigeria. But again, you have to sit back and say, just last year, education tax was increased from 2 to 2.5.
Right.
So there's always that balance that we must strike whenever policies are being designed, because you're looking at the goose that lays the golden egg. You don't want to overtax that goose on one hand. But again, you're looking at the problems, that myriads of issues that we have to necessarily deal with as a nation. And so it's a delicate balance that we must always try to strike. So I understand the rationale. I understand the thinking. Should that make it into the Finance Act, then I kind of say it. But perhaps if you sit back as a business owner, you will also want to believe that maybe we should give us time to breathe, let the businesses breathe, right? Yeah. Because the question then is, what happens next year? Are we going to expect, if it's moving from 2.5, let's say moving to 3 or 4, should we expect 5? Should we expect 6? Businesses don't plan on an annual basis. Right. They take a long-term view of investments. So if you look at that all together, then you understand? It's a bit tricky.
It is. Now I want to jump to company income tax. So you saw our conversation with the Director General of the Budget Office, where he was clarifying the non-oil taxes, and he went into VAT, CIT, and so on and so forth. So for corporations, help us here. I understand there's an increase from 30% to as much as 50? I mean, how's that going to work out, since you just ended your last question on corporations trying to breathe?
Okay, so let me backtrack a bit and just talk about that. There's a group of companies that the bill has defined. They call them gas flaring companies. Okay. Now, what does that mean? It means companies that either flare or vent gas, except in emergency situations. Okay. So if you find that you are flaring gas or you are venting gas, and it's not as a result of emergency, then you will fall into that category of companies, gas flaring companies. Okay. So what the government has done through the bill is that they are seeking to increase the tax rate of such companies from 30% to 50%.
So that's what disincentivize the flaring. What's the rationale there?
On the one hand, yes, it's to we have all the goals from COP 2020, all that net zero and all that. Yeah, that's on the one hand. That's really pretty much the rationale, and also to force investment within that sector. But you have to backtrack and also ask yourself that the PIA was just passed.
Indeed.
A lot of companies are in the middle of transition as we speak, in terms of converting from the provisions of the PIA, of the Petroleum Profit Tax and Petroleum Act, into the PIA. So in a lot of quarters, it's viewed as shifting the goalpost while the game is still on. right? So it's one that needs to be carefully. I am all for the investment in gas. I am all for us ensuring that our gas reserves are properly harnessed and that we take the maximum benefit from it. Whether we like it or not, fossils will not continue to be the thing over a long, I don't know the number of years.
Right.
I'm not going to go into the argument, but at some point, right, we need to look at the clean energy sources and see how we can harness them. Yes, the time is now. But if you think about it and you say, if you have a significant number of companies, I don't want to say all, right. Maybe it's all, that vent or flare gases. Yeah. The question is, if you make that law today, can they comply with that law today?
We'll have to leave it on that note. That's a very good point. And in fact, this is actually, thank you so much again, Uzuchukwu Obiano, partner, tax Kpmg, for taking us through the finance bill. And we stopped on that note on energy because we're going to take a break now. Rolake Akinkunmi, Fulani Akinkunmi, my colleague, is going to be part of a panel that gets in-depth on energy as far as the impact with the budget and so on and so forth. So you want to stay tuned for that. It is Budget Day, Arise TV, Kpmg. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with that panel. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to the Arise Kpmg Budget Day 2023 discussions. It's been a very dynamic day of discussions, but now we're going to be looking at the energy sector. And if there's anything last year taught us is that global dynamics are intrinsically linked to what happens in the Nigerian market domestically. Well, to help me dissect the industry in light of the budget, I've got some fantastic panelists. First, I've got Mr. Ayo Salami, Head of Energy Line of Business at KPM Nigeria. I've also got with me Mr. Okechukwu Mba, who is the MD of the Ano Gas Company. And last but by no means least is Mr. Victor Eromosele, Senior Consultant, Policy and Regulatory at ME Consulting. So let's get into the discussion. I'm going to come to you first for the opening remarks, Mr. Salami. What are your thoughts on the budget highlights from the perspective of the energy sector?
Thank you so much, Rolake. Good afternoon, distinguished panelists and viewers. In the next few minutes, I will share with us our thoughts and perspectives on the themes of the 2023 budget of the federal government of Nigeria as it relates to energy sector. Now, I'll start with the global outlook. We know that price volatility and supply disruptions caused by COVID-19 pandemic continued in 2022, right? That actually led to recession across the globe. And what that then means is that as countries tried to recover, we then saw the outbreak of the Russian-Ukraine war. That war, in a sense, has also led to price escalation, both in food and energy. So as countries try to recover, that has slowed down the recovery over the last 1 year. The other thing that is shaping the global oil and gas industry is all the conversation around energy transition, the journey towards net zero. Now, on the back of COP27 in Egypt, we've seen countries make commitments and all of those, but again, to the extent that those commitments are not backed by action, we don't know where that's going to lead us. Bringing it back home, the Nigerian oil and gas industry too, we think that there are 5 themes that will shape conversation in that industry this year and going forward. The first will be the massive oil theft with significant impact on government revenue over the last couple of years. And we're seeing how that has dealt a big blow to the government revenue last year. The second theme is commitment to achieving net zero emissions by 2060. This was a commitment made by the government of Nigeria in COP27, and we know that in the budget, there are so many pronouncements made to that effect. The third, which I would think is the big elephant in the room, is the subsidy conversation. We know that in the PIA, there were clear provisions around when the sunset date for subsidy would end. But again, sometime around this time last year, we saw that government has shifted that goalpost by 18 months, which hopefully should terminate by the middle of this year. Well, for the last 2 items, I won't also take too much time on it because I know what they speak to. So I'll move on quickly to the essence of the budget with respect to direct numbers that speak to the energy sector. We know that the budget is predicated upon production of 1.69 million barrels per day, right, up from 1.2 in November last year. And of course, on the price of $75 per barrel, again, I think they are very conservative because I know, according to the EIA, that should be around the range of $92 per barrel. We know that for the budget, January to June, government intends to spend about 3.4 trillion naira on petrol subsidy. Again, question mark. And of course, we know the allocation to both the power sector and the Ministry of Petroleum Resources sector. But for me, the key thing to discuss here is the projected oil revenue of 22% of the total revenue for the government in the year. if you look at the trajectory, I think this is overly ambitious. In context, if you put it in context, if you look at 2020 alone, 1.4 trillion was realized from that sector, from oil sector, which represented about 42% of the total revenue garnered for that year. A year later, in 2021, that amount dropped to as low as 970 billion naira, about 18% of total revenue. And last year was it. We only made 586 billion naira, which was roughly 9% of total revenue earned by the government. So if you take a look at this, I know I've heard the DG budget says that those numbers are net of subsidy, but the truth remains that that sector is underperforming and something to be done about it. Now, these are some of the projects that have been put in the budget to be executed in the energy sector, and I think it is instructive to know that in supporting the power sector, government has thought to spend about 1.6 billion naira on a distribution expansion program regarding the power from grid, which is fantastic. The other worth mentioning is construction of 215 megawatt power gas-fired cardinal power plant, which was ongoing, and government intends to pursue that to conclusion in the course of the year. So many projects highlighted in the budget, which the government intends to pursue, and we hope that that will happen if there are no constraints to revenue generation. This slide shows essentially the trajectory of our oil production, right from Q1 in 2016 to Q3 in 2022. And you can see that it peaked at about 2.07 million barrels per day in Q1 2020 and dwindled to about 1.2 million barrels per day in Q3 2022. Again, this may not be connected with the issue around oil theft and the rest. Now, my thoughts on the budget. Dependence on fossil fuel as a source of energy and foreign exchange earnings is no longer sustainable. We need to diversify, and I'm happy that DG has said a lot about the diversification effort and the impact it's having already, but that needs to be discussed extensively, and I'm going to leave it to the panel members to discuss. Nigeria being the only OPEC country that is still importing petroleum products, it is sad, and I think it's something we need to talk about. And lastly, what impact will the refineries make in our economy? Buda refinery, Dangote refinery, what impact do they make to make us self-sufficient when it comes to petroleum products? So with this thoughts, I think I will pause here and run it back to you.
Thank you very much for setting that context for us so eloquently, Mr. Salami. So I guess the first thing I want to ask you, Mr. Amba, you head a gas company. And if you look at all those figures there, our revenues have come down, production is challenged. Looking at global dynamics, for a gas company, one of the things that's key for you is incentives. But the question is there an inherent conflict between Nigeria's bid to attract investment into the oil and gas sector and the provisions of the finance bill, which are actually increasing the fiscal taxes on companies? What are your thoughts?
Thank you very much for that question. That particular aspect of the 2022 finance bill is one that gives the oil and gas industry serious concerns. And the concern here is this. This provision proposes to raise the company's income tax rate for companies that flare gas. And by the way, we are talking of a wide spectrum of oil and gas companies, from 30% to 50%. And when you check that against the provisions of the PIA that was just passed in 2021, the PIA already has a gas flare provision in it that's penalizing you for flaring gas between $0.5 to $2 per thousand square feet production volume. So there's already a punitive measure built into the PIA already, and PIA has not been passed. One thing that investors look out for is a stable regulatory and policy environment. PIA is a major transformational act for the oil industry. Stakeholders and investors are busy, analyzing it, understanding the provisions and implementing. So my call here will be for us to allow the PIA to first be fully implemented, allow that provision that's already there in Section 104 to be properly embedded, give it time to achieve the desired objective before we think about making any further provisions to amend that. And as you will recall, to be able to achieve flares out, to reduce gas flaring, you require significant investments. Investments in compressors, gas processing plants, and other facilities. And these require huge financing efforts. So one thing to think about here is, rather than adding additional disincentive, is actually to look at the principle of carrot and stick. And actually think about an incentive you can bring in to promote
capital spend is specific to gas flaring. And here we are talking of things like investment tax allowance or investment tax credit. It might appear that you're reducing government revenue. But what you achieve by unlocking these huge gas volumes that are flared today in terms of job creation, even additional tax revenue for government, that in my view will pay for itself. Absolutely. So it's key that we take a second look at that provision and, in my view, allow the PIA provision to be fully embedded first.
Great insights. Hopefully the public sector is listening. So, Mr. Aromosela, when you look at this, we've heard for a long time that Nigeria is running out of time to make the most of our oil and gas resources. And looking at what is happening globally, gas is in demand, but oil demand has obviously tanked a bit, let's be serious. There's a global energy transition going on. How do you see global dynamics really increasing the sense of urgency around incentivizing the local business environment?
As far as I'm concerned, I think the global dynamics are what they are. The truth right now is that the West actually is speaking on both sides of his mouth. At one, particularly after Ukraine, Russia attacked Ukraine, and all of a sudden we now hear, what color is gas? Is it green or? Gas suddenly became green, and that's why Nigeria can say, because gas is transitional fuel, so we are going to rely on gas. As our own way to get to net zero 2060. But the truth is that most of the world, they're not just piggybacking on gas. What they're actually doing is moving into renewable energy.
Absolutely.
Nigeria, we have so much sunshine. What are we doing with it? And our rules are very clear. By 2030, 30% of our total power should come from renewables. As I speak, if you go to Egypt, from satellite, you can see the huge field all built since 2012. Around the same time, we were talking about the 17 orders that we all shortlisted to generate 1.1 gigawatts. And that did not fall through. So Nigeria doesn't have utility scale solar. So how do we achieve this, our journey? We are actually moving sluggishly now in this our journey to net zero 2060. Forget about the rhetorics. If the truth should be said, that's it. And even in the budget, I was looking, to what extent am I going to see some nuggets that actually helps us get to net zero 2060 first, 2030.
Well, there's the Nigeria Energy Transition Plan, which complements the PIA.
Nice on paper, very nice on paper. Okay, so what extent has the budget supported that? We should equally look at that. To what extent? Like he said, we're looking at sticks and carrots. Every budget has sticks, has carrots. So what are the carrots in there to help these huge investors pouring into Nigeria and say, we're going to now even do the gas and then do the renewable energy and really get to our target? Yeah. I think those are the things we should be looking at in the context of the wider world. Gas will be there for a few more years, maybe another 2 decades, and because you need it to support renewable energy, but we still need to have a plan.
Yeah, very great points. And in fact, I hear that by 2030, India will be phasing out fossil fuel cars. And India is one of our biggest export markets. Absolutely. You talk about carrots. One of the things I want to ask you, Mr. Salami, is this whole talk of IJVs. I think a carrot for potential partners to an NNPC is the fact that NNPC should be able to raise its own finance independent. Do you see IJVs being a reasonable, sustainable, long-term means of revenue generation for NNPC, because it's going to reduce cash call obligations on the government? What are your thoughts?
Thank you very much, Rolake, and that's a very good question. But to answer that question, I will take you a little bit back to memory lane. If we look at the 2018 budget of the federal government of Nigeria, there's a revenue line item tagged joint venture asset restructuring, where the government intended to actually earn 710 billion naira, right? So the thinking then was that government was going to sell down perhaps its equity stake in the JVs so that it can minimize the demand on cash calls. That didn't happen. And for several years after that, nothing happened. So I thought, I'm not in government, but I thought the thinking then was that PIA is coming, and that was all part of the problem. Fast forward, PIA is here, and we see copious provisions around IJV. But the question is, before you go into that IJV model, a lot of things need to be done prior to that. One clearly is you've got to build a model that tells you if we transit to IJV, what is the incremental cash flow to government on a regular, sustainable basis, right? As opposed to what we have today.
Because
so
it clearly reduces
important.
Payments into the FAC account.
It's not as simple as that.
Yeah.
So you need to do that to show us that if we transit from JV to IJV model, this is incremental revenue to government on a yearly basis. But beyond that is also that you need to fix the oil theft. Because if you do IJV, put all the mechanism in place, and the oil theft still continues, the potential gains may be elusive. So for me, the question is, yes, IJV is the way to go. PIA has made provision for it. Yes, we need to do that, but we need to do a model that shows us incremental revenue for government, and then monitor that when we transit, right? And then secondly, we need to fix the issue of our oil theft for us to realize the gain.
Thank you for dissecting the issue so well. So I want to touch a bit, maybe throw two questions in one. Looking at the gas sector, infrastructure financing for gas is key. Long-term finance, we talk about low-cost finance, but the gas prices, how are we going to implement some of the provisions that we've seen in the PIA around gas prices? And is a fully liberalized market going to be a reality?
Thank you very much. The PIA has provisions currently for the authority to advise gas prices on annual basis. And the process there includes engaging with participants in the gas sector, stakeholders. So the view here is for that engagement to be robust and for those views to be taken on board, because price is one of the key commercial terms that either incentivizes or disincentivizes investment. And it's not about a particular price. It's about ensuring that the price we come out with is good enough to recover efficient costs for providing that product, and also a reasonable return back to the investor, because without making a return, investments will not come. And also to put in context that the financing we require to fully develop our gas sector is not going to come from Nigeria alone. So we are talking of international finance, and you need to see yourself as competing with other countries in terms of attracting that limited financing that's available for the energy sector. And as you know, that volume is reducing. Every moment you look at it. So we have to ensure that the price we come out with is well thought out and is set at a level that promotes further investments into the domestic
and you
gas
make
market.
a very good point, because Europe has sort of vacillated around funding gas, not funding gas. Russia, Ukraine has forced a reconsidering of the position. But I'm going to come back to you very quickly, Mr. Omasele. Assuming in a world, ceteris paribus, where we fully liberalize the downstream sector, we eliminate subsidies, we're able to finance and fund Nigeria adequately, what would you think would be the ideal energy mix for a country like Nigeria?
That's a good question. What I think is we have our sunshine. So clearly, and we said it too, that 30% of our total energy mix will come from renewables, at least for our power. We should be able to achieve that if we work towards that. It's just that that journey has been slow. And then talking about that too, we must actually, right now, most of what I hear, because there was a World Bank funded project, and from what I read, there's a lot of investment in mini grids. Mini grids are required, okay, but for our villages and so on and the rurals. But what really will make us move forward is actually utility scale solar. And then gas will always be there. It's just that not necessarily in the proportion. Then crude oil, do we need it in the existing proportion? Over the years, definitely will go down. Around the world, millions of cars will soon be driven around. Guess what? What are they powered with? Not by oil or gas. What are they powered with? Electricity. So our ability to convert solar to power now to fuel for our cars, that would be great. Nigeria has all of it. So just get our acts together, and then we'll be in that promised land where like you said, ceteris paribus, everything is fixed.
Ceteris paribus, indeed. I don't know if you have any final passing words, Mr. Mba or Mr. Salami, very briefly, around the outlook for the sector.
Yeah, in terms of outlook, is to say that looking at the significant gas reserves Nigeria has, we have enough to meet local demand and also to export to the international market. With the Russia-Ukraine conflict going on right now, I think there's an opportunity to deliver gas to Europe. And as a country, I think we should prioritize that, have those engagements, lock in gas sale opportunities, and then on the back of that, think about creating financing ideas to finance some FLNG and LNG projects to then supply into those opportunities, because this window will not be there forever.
Absolutely.
So we need to move quickly and get a share of that opportunity that exists.
Very crucial on the financing. And final words to you, Mr. Salami.
I think for me, it's for the government to revisit the provision of the PIA with respect to gas incentives. This is very important for us as a country, and except to do that, the much needed FDI will not come in to support our local capital.
Yeah, fantastic. You've heard it all here. Quite a lot to unpack in the energy sector. That's all we have time for on this particular discussion. Thanks to the panelists. We're going to go on a short break, and when we come back, Rotus will be here to sum up the highlights of the day. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome back to Arise TV. This is, of course, Budget Day with Arise TV and KPMG. It's been a very, very interesting day. Lots of insights, lots of expert analysis. And, of course, we still have more. We still have, of course, a roundup of what we've heard today. Now, of course, we want to actually get to our Twitter questions, but let me introduce the panel that we currently have right now. We have, of course, Mr. Tola Adeyemi, Senior Partner, KPMG Nigeria, and Chairman, KPMG West Africa. Thanks for joining us again, sir. And Mr. Boye Olusanya, who is the Vice Chair of the NESG, the Nigerian Economic Summit Group. You're very welcome. And sitting right next to me, the Deputy Managing Director, Arise TV Lagos, Mr. Emmanuel Efeni. You should recognize him every morning when he goes to the newspaper review. Mr. Efeni, you're very welcome. Thanks for joining us. Before we summarize what we've heard today, we do have some more Twitter questions. I just wanted to throw to our representatives on the panel here. From Philip Isiakba, who is, of course, a publisher with Business AM. He says, how does the panel think that a new government will deal with this budget, given the huge variance that will exist between the aim of the budget and the goals of a new government? His second question along the same lines. How do you think a new government addresses the shortcomings of this past budget upon getting into office May 29th? So I guess the challenges ahead for the new government budget-wise. What do you think, sir?
Well, I think first is they've been dropped in it right away because the removal of subsidy, which is a key tenet of the budget, if you look at the revenue generation profile the government has put out, falls right in June, which actually falls into the tenure of the new government. So in the transition phase, they better be prepared to do that, because I think that's the most sustainable thing that they can do. The other thing that I think, or there are two other things I think that they require to do. One, this government is also doing, which is ensuring that there is a credible long-term solution to the current ways and means problem, because until you solve that long-term debt problem, it continues to be an overhang on the economy. The other thing is they have got 2 to 3 months of a transition period. I mean, we at NESG continue to push for an open, globally competitive, private sector-led government, and we will participate with any of the winners in ensuring that during that transition phase, there is reasonable dialogue about exactly how best to deal with the seemingly large but not insurmountable issues that the Nigerian economy currently has.
So the takeaway is they've got to hit the ground running. So the cabinet has to be announced immediately and you just move. Thank you so much, sir. Mr. Demi, what's your thoughts?
There's a certain amount of inevitability about where we are as a country. And there are things that just have got to be addressed. So Mr. Olusanya had spoken about some of them. In addition to that, I would say security. That's a no-brainer. The new government has got to continue to strengthen security in the country, because that's fundamental to whatever objectives that government sets for itself. The other one is infrastructure. Again, they have to continue the spending on infrastructure, as well as the spending that they're doing in the social development area, education, healthcare. Today, we're facing a migration crisis in which a number of our young people are leaving the country. We've got to address improvements in social development in order to try to stem some of those things. So to my mind, there's an inevitability about the situation the country is in. They're hard decisions that the new government must take if they want to succeed.
Thank you so much. Mr. Finney, you have to chip in here. You go through these headlines on a daily basis. What do you think is ahead for this next government?
Well, political will, I would say. Because if you have to remove subsidy 1 month after taking office, you think back, good luck, Jonathan came in 2011 with all the aplomb, popularity. 2012, January, remove subsidy. Remember what happened. So the political will be necessary for the next government to do the needful.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ifeni. All right, I wanted to get your thoughts on what we've heard so far as, I guess, a summary. So much has been discussed, so we could have a long summary, but what are your thoughts on what we've heard so far? Your takeaways?
Well, I mean, the key takeaways, I've already spoken about subsidy, which forms a significant part. Government continues to need to drive the creation of an environment in which the private sector can thrive. I have also spoken about the situation with Ways and Means and the need for sustainable debt. Now, government also has done a significant deficit budget this year, and it's something that government needs to sit down with the private sector on, because there's only so much money that exists in this space, and we and government cannot be huddling into a small space. So we need to start finding ways to expand that bucket. Allied to that is there needs to be a drive for productivity in this economy. We need to start finding ways to drive production, which means investment coming in and some form of mechanics to drive that. From our perspective at NESG, we've continually held dialogue with government about how they need to start seeing the drive for low interest rates as a mechanism for ensuring productive investment. Like you want investment in manufacturing. We talk about you need all of that, but in an interest rate environment that's high, that continues to get more and more difficult. And unless you address the inflation issue, right, you cannot address directly the interest rate issue. So government needs to focus radically on inflation as it is. Today we're talking about 21% inflation. That's, apart from what the damage it is doing to consumer purchasing power, it's a big disincentive to anyone to invest. So we've had talks about that. Taxation. Now, Nigeria does have a huge taxation problem, and there's no doubt that we need to widen and deepen taxation. But we also can't over-regulate and overtax those who are in the system, right? Because that in itself becomes a disincentive. So on the one hand, we need to create this environment where we widen the tax base, because our tax to revenue ratio is bad. So no doubt we need to do that. But as I said, we need to be careful not to over-regulate and overtax and kill the golden goose that's laying the egg. There's a particular conversation earlier on which spoke about potential taxation in the energy sector, which has a detrimental impact on investments that can come into that sector. The need for security on the oil side, in particular, in our ability to address the supply-demand issues we have on the foreign exchange front, because that's a big, what we're leaving on the table in terms of foreign exchange we're not getting from oil that is, whether it's not produced or it's stolen, is significant enough that it will make a huge difference to that supply-demand side, and will allow us to systematically actually address the foreign exchange issue, which we need to deal with, but we need to deal with it in a way that actually does not do damage to the economy on the other side of it. So, those are key things that have come out. And I would say, once again, if we look at all the initiatives that we've come up with at NESG, there are loads and loads of plans that are there. Right. I don't think there's a shortage of ideas as to what needs to be done. And I'll go back to the comment that was made about what new government needs to do. There just needs to be a will and a desire to implement and follow through on the action items.
Thank you so much for that. Mr. Ademi, what are your thoughts, your takeaways from today?
So as I build on what Mr. Olusonya has said, I look at this also from the perspective of businesses. And I say, so what should businesses be doing, given everything that's been discussed here? For me, the key thing, businesses have got to be strategically agile. This is going to be a year in which we're going to have a change in administration. We also see some headwinds that are going to portend some difficulties for business. So businesses have got to adopt scenario-based planning and make sure that they're able to adapt what they're doing to the changes that we might see as the year goes on. The other thing that's clear is that the cost pressures that we've spoken about, those are likely to continue. So again, thinking through cost optimization and ways of really managing costs will be essential. Tax, it's quite clear that taxes are going to go up, and we may well see a new government come in with new ways of taxation. As has been said already, we don't want to kill those who are already being taxed, but thinking through about tax optimization strategies is another area that businesses need to think about. I spoke earlier about the migration or emigration crisis we're facing. Many businesses are losing talent. Again, really focusing on what needs to be done to retain talent and also ensure we're developing appropriate succession plans. So for businesses operating in Nigeria, there are a number of issues that they need to start addressing within the context that we've all spoken about. So my takeaway here is that businesses need to be proactive, they need to be agile, and they need to really focus on cost management in the period that lies ahead of us.
Thank you so much, Mr. Adeyemi, Senior Partner, Kpmg, and of course the Chairman, Kpmg West Africa, and of course to you, Mr. Boye Olusonya, Vice Chair of the NESG, the Nigerian Economic Summit Group. Our closing remarks now are going to come from Mr. Emmanuel Efeni, Deputy Managing Director of Rise TV, Lagos. Mr. Efeni.
A simple task.
Exactly.
Not as difficult as that of
That's
the
the
DG.
analysis.
Yes. Now, well, on behalf of the Chairman of this day Arise Group, Prince Nduka Obagbena, CON, I want to thank everybody who have made this possible. Budget Day 2023 is not going to be the last. There will be more budget days to come. The conversation we have started here, it will definitely continue, not ending with this program. We want to thank the DG, the Director General of the Budget Office, Dr. Ben Akabweze, for finding time to come and shed more light on the gray areas of Budget 2023. Of course, the conversation will continue. It will get more robust as implementation continues, because you have supplementary budgets just signed into law. Budget 2022 extended by 3 months, 2023 budget. So as you implement, it has to be effective. The conversation will get more robust. I'm sure Dr. Bernard Kabweze will be ready at any point to shed more light. And I want to thank Kpmg, Tola, Adeyemi, and all the eggheads at the Kpmg Towers who are putting their brains to work for businesses, for clients, and for country.
Thank you.
We'll do this one more time and in the years ahead. And of course, we'll have to thank everybody who has made this possible. But I know, Rotus, you have the last word.
All right. My last word is to just simply thank everyone for coming together to put this together. Again, as Mr. Efeni said, our thanks to Kpmg. Again, we are coming to you live from the Insight Center in Kpmg Towers in the commercial capital of Africa's largest economy, Lagos, Nigeria. So our thanks to everyone. Our thanks to you, of course, our audience, for the Twitter questions and, of course, for interacting with us. We say goodbye from the Insight Center here in Kpmg Towers. And, of course, stay tuned to Arise News. I'm Rutus Odiri of the Global Business Report. Thanks for watching.